Hey, ho, podcast.
Oh, God, jeez. Ugh.
It's supposed to rhyme.
Meh, overrated. Welcome to the podcast, guys.
Well,
the Crash Course podcast,
right.
if you didn't realize, by clicking on whatever you did to get here.
They realized from this spiel. Whew.
I'm Matt.
I'm John.
And I'm Steve.
Up front, I want to talk a little bit about what I did this weekend. I had the benefit of being able to go to the Warped Tour, which I had not been to in 5 years, so half a decade.
This time you went as press, though.
I did. I want to thank upfront MC Lars for offering me his available guest ticket to come to the show. He was a pleasure to hang out with. He was stoked to see me. He remembered me from the interview. We chatted for a while, got some photos and bullshitted. He said hi to the rest of the team and is interested on coming on this show if he's ever in New York for more than a day or two. So I hung out with him for a bit. I got to see his set. Before that, I got to see a non-gimmicky Jewish rapper with the best name ever, Kosha Dills. And he is a Jewish rapper.
This was at Warped Tour?
At Warped Tour.
Okay.
There's a lot of rap at Warped Tour, but they have like a punk aesthetic. And he did. He had his Warped Tour shirts that he was selling were all in Hebrew, but it had like the logo and stuff, which was actually pretty awesome.
I'm kind of picturing Panless Parker, because to me, he's the Jew with the punk aesthetic. Or the go-to Jew with the punk aesthetic.
Fair enough, but he doesn't play punk music or rap music.
True, but he used to, as he told us.
That's true.
It was on our show, episode 63. Check it out.
But so he was really good, and I connected with him, gave him my card. He wants to be on the podcast. He's local to Jersey, but he's on tour with the Warped Tour. I picked up his newest record, which I've enjoyed since I've been listening to it. I also, of course, then, following him, I saw MC Lars, who is fantastic. He has a spiel for his song Mr. Raven, where he brings the same 9-year-old girl, although I'm sure she was younger when she first started doing it, to come sing backup with him on stage. And it's adorable and amazing. I've seen it at 2 New York shows he's done so far.
Now, I have a question. As press, did you show up wearing a fedora with a feather in it?
So technically,
and also the giant overload camera.
Technically, I wasn't press. I didn't have a badge. I just I had a guest ticket under an artist, so I was a welcome guest. So it's not the same thing.
Okay.
Next time, we have to get you some sort of everyday man kind of a hat, circa 1930s, with a large sign that says press.
Exactly.
And some, I don't know, just plain black, large-rimmed glasses, as well as suspenders for your shirt and tie.
Stereotyping
press people.
I was going to finalize that with a onesie unitard underneath that was...
I got it. You were going for Superman.
I was sticking with the camera, with the flash that goes like well over your head.
That said, though, I did cover the show, or at least the bands that I saw. The plan is to do a write-up. Let's see if I can actually own up to that.
You work on that.
But then after MC Lars, I also saw a band called Tat, who I've seen before. They're a female-fronted punk band that's true punk rock, like old school, across the pond. She's actually British. The whole band is. But she was playing an acoustic set because the rest of the band was overseas, fine-tuning their album coming out in 2016. What was very cool and that I enjoyed is I connected with her because she saw that I was one of the few people in the front row singing along to every song that wasn't a new song. And so she connected with me. She saw that I was doing it. And so then when I came up afterwards, she gave me a hug. She thanked me. We chatted for a while. And I told her about both podcasts. She's stoked to at least phone in for autographs. So I'm in the process of working that out. So I want to thank Tatiana as well as MC Lars and Kosher Dills for their time and for getting to chat and hopefully having them on the show again soon. Or for the first time for those who hadn't been previously.
Yeah, figure it out. Well, that's all very neat.
I'm
not jealous, but John should be, because he was invited.
Yes, I did. MC Lars did apologize about that. Apparently, Warped Tour cracked down on the guest tickets. All the artists only got one. They were supposed to get a few, and it didn't work out.
I forgive them.
How egalitarian of you, John.
I will say, though, not having to pay for a ticket and leaving after only a few bands because of how brutally hot it was on Sunday was kind of nice. Because in the past, I've gone through that and had wasted money because, you pay for an all-day festival, you want to stay for the whole thing.
Obviously.
But anyway, I digress. So that was a blast. I posted some photos on our Facebook page, so please check them out. All the artists were really great, and I enjoyed the music that I saw or heard, as it were.
Well, both.
Both, technically, yes.
Yeah,
on a technicality.
That's what you do at a concert.
Anyway, I've spieled enough. It's time to let someone else spiel for a while. Steve, please tell us about our album for this week.
I, the resident spieler. Today is my pick, and that pick is Damogen Furies by Squarepusher. So, Squarepusher is the alias of Tom Jenkinson, a UK-based artist known for a highly avant-garde interpretation of techno, burgeoning out into what is generally called acid techno. Now, as you might guess from the name, some might say that the genre acid techno is inherently avant-garde. These artists strive for rapid-fire, moment-by-moment investment. The semiest of quavers in the course of just a millisecond is just as important as the whole. Something I very much appreciate. But they also might sacrifice consonants a lot of the time, sometimes perhaps sacrificing tonal centers entirely. After all, techno, even without the acid, is often focused on rhythm, which means its nearest acoustic equivalent is that of a pure drum solo. Imagine that rare, penultimate moment in the course of a concert where all the other instruments cease and breathe and yield to the drummer, who is now front and center and free to do whatever he otherwise couldn't do, at least not without taxing the reactive capabilities of all others involved. It's an eerie, almost vacuum of a moment in concerts, and that's because rhythmic exploration is a whole nother frontier to most people. Apart from the larger-than-life figures like Gene Krupa, Max Roach, Neil Peart, John Bonham, or Ringo Starr.
I actually knew a bunch of those names.
Well, mine is one.
Brief relative segue. I watched Hard Day's Night for the first time as an adult recently. A lot funnier as an adult.
Oh, yeah. No, all those movies are comedies now.
Alex, for his birthday, Alex Bell of the Wasties, got Hard Day's Night on Blu-ray, the new upgraded version, the retouched version, as a birthday present, so we watched it.
My favorite line is, "He's a dirty old man." Anyway.
He's so clean.
I know. So apart from the figures I just mentioned, for the most part, until certain branches of electronica took root, on a discographical scale, this vacuum has been relatively unexplored. Since that time, though, many diverse communities have developed around it, despite the fact that they use, of course, artificial means to do so. Often these communities start out fairly underground, some might say they're still pretty underground, but there are giants among them, and one among them is Tom Jenkinson, aka Squarepusher. Now, obviously, having been around since 1994, Tom Jenkinson has gone through many phases. He is quite prolific, now with 16 albums under the Squarepusher name, not counting a plethora of EPs, singles, and collaborations. Within this work, you'll find that there are times when he's more ambient, times when he's more consonant, and there are times when you could just barely keep up with him. He has many influences from jazz, he's a bassist, that should be noted, to metal, to other electronica artists, one of which we reviewed earlier this year, and that's Aphex Twin. So let's see what he conjures up on his latest experiment, Damogen Furies.
It starts off with the first track of Store Iglis.
Oh,
and
yes.
We're going to butcher some of these names here. It's just going to happen.
I think that's the only one that might get butchered.
I issue a challenge to our audience, if they're so inclined. If you do know a story behind these titles, we've tried. We haven't really found anything. If there's a story or a language behind these titles, please let us know.
Well, it's very consistent with his earlier titles. I have known Squarepusher, I probably should mention, since around early, mid-2000s.
And he's always done this kind of naming convention?
Yeah, I mean, even it's in some of the titles themselves, like Buzz Kaner, and then some of them are just like oddball. They almost look like it's its own language or borrowed from a language. I can't quite tell.
You'd previously mentioned Aphex Twin. He also did the same thing.
He did the same thing. They were more numerical. They almost looked like it was just a stray file on his hard drive. But these are a little more straightforward.
So we get our intro to this track is a thumping bass beat, something you think you'd hear in a club. You know, that kind of heavy rhythm that is in a lot of trance and club music. But it diverges from that fairly quickly with a tinny kind of cymbal sound to go with it, which kind of gives it more a little bit
higher in the attack range than what you'd normally expect from just steady trance-oriented introduction. This, when you start working with that, faux piano gets introduced, a screeching sweep gets introduced, and that becomes one of the main melodic components of the song itself. There's already different tools being used here than what you would expect in more mainstream club and trance-oriented music.
Well, I do want to talk about this split between the intro and what would be perceived as the main section here. Because to start out, you get what I bet anyone outside the techno field would probably call like an industrial backdrop. It's marked by these steady impacts, although perhaps from a trance perspective, you couldn't exactly call the opening rhythm like a fist pump, because while it has the depth and the resonance, it's far too frantically paced, almost like a half-broken machine. Something that's desperately trying to catch the right gear, but it just can't do it, so it's like caught in a loop. I also kind of pictured like a gif of something repeated over and over. That's how I kind of interpret these opening 20 seconds.
And that's one of the main reasons why industrial is a word often associated both thematically and musically towards electronica music. Nowadays, since we have a lot of electronics in our industry, and just from the fact that everything sounds a little bit off, a little bit unnatural, like robots, like assembly lines, a lot of this sort of gets pigeonholed into it.
A little bit.
That said, once things like that screechy, high, breathy violin comes in, a whole new aspect sort of gets introduced to the song itself. It becomes semi-natural.
Yeah, it's almost violinish, but it is natural to the point that the way I said before, how he might lack consonants or have consonants. Well, this is an example of consonants. You could flat out call it a hook if you want. I mean, the resolution here at around 30 seconds goes into what could be called a hook, as if the machine from earlier did finally catch and grab hold of something tangible. So what we get here is something more on his consonant side, and frankly, it would probably be reminiscent of a more tonal safety that is trance, if it weren't for the fact that you have this continuously reshaping rhythmic backdrop in the background. That's something that really stays close to acid techno almost throughout the entire album.
That and the fact that they're also producing high-attacking beats. These high-attacking beats, very clipped, either in the beginning or the end, really add an unusual flavor to what I do know as a standard percussion line in electronica in general.
Right.
Because it's clipped and in a lot of cases feels compressed, though the notes themselves, the tones themselves, are complete. They're not warped in any way. They're just pushed together a little bit quicker than what most people are attuned to.
I think also to note here, what's important about the intro versus this now very trance kind of rhythm and structure that we're getting is it's very high energy, and it feels something. I mean, Steve kind of phrased it perfectly, almost on the safer side, I guess, of trance, this kind of. It's a format that I can formulate a brain structure around. I've heard not this, but something reminiscent of this before.
The reason I'd say that is probably because texture-wise, it is much more open, much more inviting, and it's familiar synths like you'd find in trance, and the kind of trance that might play in halls and such. Also, the melody kind of just falls down F-sharp minor. It's very easy to get on board with, despite that the home chord centers more in D major, so you kind of get a little bit of this Lydian feel. Still, that's very lighthearted and very free-flowing. But also, very soon, you get this trade-off in the primary instrument. The synth that falls down F-sharp minor soon becomes less prominent, and then a much higher instrument really takes on a new role as the melody, despite that the former still keeps going as the only tangible figuration in the piece. After all, it is very easy to latch onto a scale. But that secondary instrument, though a little more sparse, I think is far more playful, and it really reacts against the rhythmic backdrop. It kind of alters between accents on the downbeat, then suddenly it's on the upbeat, and though it's very evasive, it is still very consonant. But that's not what I'm used to with Squarepusher. He has a tendency to really go off. Then again, this is just track one.
And there is a little bit of that going off aspect as the song moves along.
True.
Even before this, I guess I want to call it my cruising piano synth. Only because of its association with some of my favorite, 18-year-old, 19-year-old, for me, songs when I was driving, like Darude Sandstorm, a song that honestly will be my penultimate driving song. Sweeps, very drawn out, reminiscent of piano work or even other upright type of pieces. It's long, it's drawn out in a lot of aspects. But even before this comes in, we get a subtle glitch work done.
Yeah, that starts to me around minute 12 or so. It's actually, in one sense, it's a little bit more similar to trance, just in the fact that you have those cutouts of layers, and then you maintain certain things. The figuration will just cut out entirely, but then the melody will rattle on, and then the beatbox rattles on, and then we get that sort of a transition. But that could also very well be a secondary theme here. Still, it kind of has the air of a transition. At this point, it was still kind of safe to me. It kind of reminded me of a group called Rat-a-tat, which we all know Rat-a-tat. They tend to do something a lot more melodic, with their brand of electronica.
Well, Rat-a-tat, the thing I like about Rat-a-tat on a slight tangent is that their electronica tends to fit a more rock and roll structure. I could easily kind of get a sense of a rock and roll song from that, whereas this... Well, there's actually a precursor to some stuff we get later, but mostly this fits very firmly in acid techno.
Right, but to go back to what John said, in this sort of hazy region between like minute 12 where we get that transition up closer to maybe like 2:45, the primary melody kind of like re-enters, and then suddenly the beatbox just seems so much more dominant to me. The melody is just like smothered by the beatbox completely. And this is kind of where Squarepusher lies. It was actually a deceptively consummate piece until that point. And then rhythmically, we're just off on an acid trip. This is where it might be more appropriate to invoke the genre glitch as a descriptor, in fact.
Yeah, this kind of bug in the machine aspect was subtly introduced in that transitional piece, but as time goes on, especially in that reintroduction of the melody, with these sweeping, what I call the pseudo pianos, is just built a little bit here, there, and everywhere, and interferes with everything. And that's one of the things that I love about glitch, and I love about really old school experimental acid,
right?
Where they start like just devolving things, just taking things apart in the sort of way that you expect breakdowns in more classic-oriented rock and roll. Back to classical, here the breakdowns in this sort of a piece are the machine failing, the falling apart of the actual tones themselves. This is one of the more iconic aspects of what you would get with glitch, what you would get with acid.
Right, and we get that here, and we get it even more so later on the album. But the funny thing is that this track is, as far as, if you were just speaking about the sectional portions of it, there's still a lot here that can be predicted. For instance, it doesn't stay here. At some point, we sort of go back to the A section, and then we have our full-on melody again. At that point, return to the ballroom, whatever. But beyond that, we kind of move away. It's just this back and forth, which is still very A-B. You could liken it to verse-chorus if there were lyrics. But there are moments within this where he kind of like hints at the complexities that he's capable of, which isn't to say that anything going on here isn't complex. I just know from my knowledge of Squarepusher that this is the tip of the iceberg. So just as an example, I especially like the point closer to like 3 minutes 37 seconds. So note the timestamps exactly here, where for the first time we do actually have this steady pump for about maybe 20 seconds. The steadiest thing so far, as if like the frenetic character of the piece just had to align for a moment to work out a tick. And then sure enough, it starts breaking apart. It maintains control for just a little bit too long, going really, really fast, and then it starts overlapping itself after a few beats, as if like the metronome had just broken and the beats are imperfect. Then you realize it's all part of a larger plan. The imperfection aligns with the triplets, and then they align with more double-time rhythm, and it all just builds up to the big reprise that you get in the outro. It was a really great, return.
But one of the things that was actually missing in that outro was that sweepy, screechy violin melody. That was no longer present. It actually had taken a backseat and sort of fallen off the face of the earth. It was showing some evolution as far as the beat work was going, as the rhythm is going, but also chaos at the same time. The lack of that melody really promoted that chaos that they introduced.
Yeah, that may have in fact been even earlier, because I seem to recall that the melody was going on in this particular section, and it was just kind of like, hammering it out like the final anthem, as it were. But there were sections earlier where it did cut.
I think my biggest problem with this track was mostly that emotionally I didn't really... I couldn't find a setting, I couldn't find an emotion, other than like the chaos that you mentioned, like there wasn't a clear path for the song, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm just saying for me, I was kind of intrigued by the haze, but also kind of lost in it. I couldn't really find anything as far as a narrative, a setting, any kind of story or character other than the music itself being a character, but I couldn't really get a clear picture.
I have 2 points on that, but I think John does too.
I saw this as more of an actual kind of uplifting but dangerous introduction to the album itself. The way everything seems to orient towards a rise, everything seems to orient towards a sweeping melody. Taking that and then introducing that chaos, it is uplifting in several ways. It is promoting energy and a more favorable outcome, but because of the chaos it introduced, because of the fractured nature of the outro, it definitely wasn't a pure idea.
Yeah, let me be clear. I felt the high energy. It was there. It was obvious. It's just, I didn't feel much more detail than that.
Yeah, you don't see like a big emotional center just in energy itself.
No,
and I hear you on that. The 2 points that I was going to bring up is, in fact, one I thought that John was going to bring up. He didn't quite bring it up. And that's the idea that behind this whole, like, acid techno thing, I don't feel that, like, it necessarily aims to go toward a specific emotion.
Sure.
John was actually mentioning this earlier, that a lot of times it just aims to fuck with you. And that's it. It just screws with your mind as you go. But the second point I was going to make is the fact that this first track, because it's more trance-oriented and it's not yet what I'd call full-blown acid, because we have that really, really consonant melody, I find that really I'm not even at that stage yet.
Sure.
I'm not even at the point where it's like blowing my mind every second. Instead, I liken it more to the feel, though not in every technical element, that I would get from a trance piece heard in the midst of a ballroom atmosphere, you know? And there could very well be, if it was a little more regular, there could be a fist-pumping environment to this. And for that reason, additionally, I guess I don't feel a lot more, because I never associated that with much else other than energy.
Yeah. I think that, you know, also as an intro track, it didn't really have to do much more than this. I feel like it did accomplish its position on the album. It's just, again, I was looking for something a little more and didn't really get it. It doesn't really hurt it a lot. It's just something I definitely noticed.
Yeah, no, it was definitely fun to me, but it was a little bit of a safe opener, I think, at least for what I know of his work. So from there, let's go on to track 2, Baltang Ort. Now, I gotta say, this was a trolling if I've ever been trolled, because Baltang Ort begins with a solemn, almost a dignified air. It's a stark contrast from what we just experienced. For about 3 measures, it's pure ambience. I felt like I was either in a mountain monastery or like the open cosmos. And then that 4th measure hits. Rah, 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 rah. It's essentially what happens for just 1 measure. And then it goes back and the cycle starts over again. We're back in the cosmos for 3 measures. And then rah, 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 rah. It's the best way I could describe it, because that sound bite really sounds like a vocalizer patched through and just repeated over and over and over again. And then cut and spliced really sharply at the ends of each measure.
Well, that kind of gives it, like, so this I found kind of a setting, or sort of a feeling, like that combination that you described gave it this kind of haunting nature, but not like horror movie haunting, more like haunting in a kid's cartoon. Like a little bit cheeky, a little bit goofy, but definitely creepy. And I think it was the mix of that ambient with that odd soundbite kind of really gave it a feel of some kind. Something stronger than I for sure got in the previous track.
Yeah, no. I mean, with me, it was just hard to kind of re-immerse myself in the whole open cosmos environment after that.
Sure.
Given that I'd been trolled. I mean, it's not that I have, like, any misgivings about my expectations here. I know that he's going to pull this stuff on me, but I guess the split in character from, like, the 3 measures of one thing to one bizarre measure of something else, it was rather pronounced. That said, it's not hard for me to appreciate the comedy here. I really like the Cosmos segment, but maybe it did need some interruption. Otherwise, it would be ambient music, and that's not why people are going to Squarepusher.
No, for sure not.
One of the more defining features of acid-oriented, acid house, acid techno in general is the idea of squelching, which, to describe it in layman's terms, is a sound a finger makes on glass. That kind of a noise.
Like a squeegee sound, too.
Yeah, exactly. That's another way of putting it. It tends to be a high attack in the beginning, a clipped at beginning part. Something that really does put your eardrums over the edge at times. Fading out fairly quickly most of the time, but compressing, cutting, shaping the actual sound a little bit more than what you normally hear. Basically, you're within that single note or a single tone, you're changing the pitch or changing the volume pretty dramatically over a quarter of a second, if that much.
Right. And you heard this in what section here?
In how the rah-rah-rahs were being done. Just the nature of cutting them short. Not really having a beginning or an end to the flow of that noise to make them feel very clipped is something that I would definitely equate towards his sound.
Yeah, no, I could probably equate that too. For me, it was just really, really random. And it doesn't stick around that long either. Finally, once it goes through a few cycles, we're kind of out of that, and then we're in more spastic territory. Yeah. The acid starts stepping in here. Around like 1 minute, 19 seconds, this is what I would start to call a part B, because it's a lot more spastic. The only real constant, in fact, is maybe the tone. The same tone that we heard in the very, very beginning during the sections that were more open and more eerie, the Cosmos sections. And just these really 3 tones here, although there they went a little further. Here, it's reduced itself just to 3 tones. F sharp, down to F, down E flat. just kind of like it did in the beginning. It's just this ambient thing. But now it starts expanding that a little bit by adding some extra texture. Here we get the F sharp, then suddenly it this outward motion down to F and A simultaneously, then out to the full fifth, E flat and B flat simultaneously. I love that outward motion here, just as a harmony, the only harmony that we have in this piece at this point, because beyond that, it's again pure glitch.
Well, it's not quite glitch. It's more of a free-for-all with the snare drum and cymbal sounds that he's using.
Yeah.
Everything that's going on there is...
We'll stick with acid techno.
It's driving the track. It's driving and directly contrasting the melodies and the harmonies that are going on with those sweeps. This is some of the more interesting things for me, where you're focusing on the larger tones. I love this speed.
Oh, they're not very large. They're in fact not prominent at all. There are parts where just after goes through that cycle of notes, and they're in the background too. They're weak. They have the same weakness as they did in the beginning when they were unaccompanied by any rhythm. But now they're dominated by rhythm, and frankly, they really pale. They pale in comparison. They fail to dominate back. They fail to provide any character apart from this just constancy that holds true from the very, very beginning. Instead, now, though, we're just stuck in pure rhythmic territory. Whether you want to call it glitch, you want to call it acid techno, it has direction of its own now, and you're more invested, I agree completely, in that, the intricacy, in the course of the measure, and how he extends certain notes, extends certain pitter-patters, all that sort of thing.
And for all of its spasticity, is that a word?
Yeah, no,
I'm going to go with that as a word.
I've used it.
Okay.
That doesn't mean it's a word.
The actual beat work that's going on here, the rhythm work that's going on here, is regular. It just doesn't sound regular because of the changes to pitch he's really fooling around with. And that's one of my... That I love. I love fooling around with pitch with these parts.
Yeah.
Well, what's really great also is that at times it almost takes on the air of a beatboxer. Just the way that kind of percussion sounds. And it really kind of feels that way towards the end, too, because you get this kind of super speed percussion outro that really does feel like the electronic tones are reminiscent of something a electronic tune beatboxer, say, Korean FX would do, where he sounds like a robot.
Yeah, that was at the tail end, and that's what we really, really wait for.
Yeah.
But amidst that, there's a lot of back and forth here. Times, again, when it's pure percussion, times when you do just get the tones themselves, and I do remember the moment that you were talking about, John, around where the tones start kind of becoming a little more warped, a little more dense, and they start taking on a higher register. But even still, they tend to get completely smothered by the rhythm, which just gets more and more complex. Yeah, it's speed, again, through the lens of the fact that there's a lot happening in the course of just a single measure. But there's also other little elements, like around 319. There's a section where, for a time, the motif is completely absent, and the remaining percussion is almost dainty. It just features these pops that get clipped and interrupted, a lot of metallic sounds in the midst here. It was a strange interlude for the piece. I thought, it's like the percussion is in some sense trying to pursue exactly what those tones had just pursued, and it does it in a marvelous way. And this, to me, is pure sound art right here. And then after that, the tonal motif comes back, and you could almost call that a full-on A prime, the same outward motion. And then we work toward the closing material, where we even bring back the vocalizer effect, the rah-rah, and then you get that closing section, which is the phenomenal. This would occur, and this is what Matt was talking about, specifically around 5 minutes, 19 seconds. The dynamics of this final section are phenomenal. It's actually a lot more regular, but very high energy, and the accents are riveting. It's almost like a racing game where you're just in the zone. Kind of reminded me of the soundtrack for Need for Speed back in the late 90s.
But I would do one better because of the style of this. It would remind me of the Speed Racer live action movie. Bright colors, fast pace, it really felt that way. Things were just bright lines passing by.
Well, I don't only equate it to the game because I feel like I'm immersed at this point. You're just focused.
Yeah.
Driving may become a theme for this album itself. It's hard to differentiate one to the other, and a lot of times.
I would use the word theme loosely.
If you want to crash a lot, I mean, let's go to track 3 here.
This is Rake Fire 2.
This was fun. This was just absolutely fun. You have a description for this opening, which I want to hear.
So the thing that at first I tried to equate it to a 32-bit sound because I always take electronic sounds back to video games, but I went one better.
As you do.
The exact sound that this intro is making, at least for the first 10 seconds or so, maybe a little longer by itself, is the sound of an old school ream printer. So you like the ink printers that had reams of paper with holes on the side that you had to pull off. The kind of, sound where it would go and the structure of this whole intro follows and has a very similar soundbite to that.
The ones with the full-on 16-pin connector
Yeah.
in pre-USB. I love that era, and it really is the most apt. I can't think of anything else to equate this to, frankly. If you're just going on the tone, and the tone is pretty constant. It's that same exact sound over and over and over, and even the rhythm seems to match the rhythm that you'd expect from that kind of printer.
Yeah.
It starts with this evasive 2-beat triplet. It's 3 over the course of 2, and then the resonating accent on the 3, and it lingers over the course of beats 3 and 4. It lingers, echoes, and then finally disperses for the remainder of the measure. Also, on the first beat, there's a secondary sound bite. That's probably one of the few other pieces of instrumentation on this entire track, and that's this wailing guitar sound. Mm-hmm. Just a single note. I noticed that it was a D, and it trails off. It's just gone after a while. For 8 measures or so, it's gone. But the next time it comes back, then suddenly it wails outward again, but this time it pitch bends upwards, which is kind of a great element of texture, I thought, because it stands out in a crowd, and it adds this almost this pain to the course of this track, and it appears in small doses. The main element, though, always comes back to that rhythm, always comes back to that ream printer sound. And it's the craziest part, because it progressively gets more intricate. I love when it's just eighth notes. It feels even more awkward, because when it follows the triplet, it's I love how decisively it just leaves, and we go from that triple meter to duple meter. And then when it comes down to pure 16th notes, I love the dynamics of the staccato and the decay and the reverb. It's like a machine gun. It's outstanding.
And it keeps these evolving rhythms throughout the song. It sits with it for a long time. 1/3 of the track is almost the same thing from beginning to end. Because of the pitch changing, because of the slight variances he's throwing in there, it really does feel like a lot more is going on than what's actually going on. And this is probably the closest to true 1980s, mid-80s style of acid house. When they first came out, one of the 2 features was you take one single line and you just mess with the pitch over the course of it.
In concept, I'd agree with you, but as far as execution, I'm inclined to think this is something wildly new here.
The other aspect is also a conceptual idea that it's keeping true to, which is simplicity. Keep your lines uncluttered. Keep your layers simple. Don't do 15, 20 layers. We're talking about 2, maybe 3 solid layers going on right here. Because of how much is going on with the pitch change, it sounds like there's a lot more.
Yeah, it's the ream printer, the guitar, and there was something else, but it was pretty benign.
Well, the thing is this is the first track where we're really getting a setting or storytelling, but it's simply being told by mostly that one soundbite at different speeds. And that's what's fascinating, is that it goes from just being an old school ream ink printer to that in a natural disaster, and then that in hyperspace hyperspeed. The dynamics and the changes kind of take it all over the place.
It's actually a brilliant display of sound art if you really think of it in those terms, because then it's it's actually just printed you something. It's going through all these different rhythms in order to give you this kind of dotted, you have to sort of go out of focus in order to see what it is, but then it's very, very crisp, and you can only get that to look at this track at a glance. You're on the ride until it's complete.
And if you're going to look at it as this sort of cluttering and compressing of the tones together to go to 8th notes, to go to 16 notes, it's speeding up.
Yeah.
It's a fast-forwarding kind of effect, and it comes off kind of mischievous about it. It's a little cheeky, all said and done, to feel like this thing is doing this printer or anything like that. If that's the setting we're looking at, it's doing its job over and over and over again. It's the same job over and over again, but it's not boring about it.
No.
It still remains fresh. It's throwing in little accents. Instead of periods, maybe it's printing out an exclamation point when it shouldn't be. There's something going on there that's that does have a lot of depth for something that might be inanimate.
There's something else going on. It's something that's fairly subtle, and it's almost besides the point, but it's very important, and that's the tone and the chordal centers here. Because despite the rhythm is really what just dominates here, but within that, it's kind of soloing. Like if you look past the rhythm, there is a lot of just like inner, going up the scale, going down the scale, there's a lot of skipping over, but for the most part, a lot of it is on generally one chordal area, and it's just sort of freestyling in its midst. Still, there's a lot, it's intricate in that into place. It couldn't have the same reaction, I think, if it were a little more dissonant. Instead, this is pretty straightforward from a tonal perspective, and that keeps you more invested on the rhythm.
I think that's probably what hooked me the most, is it's a rare case where we get something that is repetitive, but not in the way we're used to. It's repeating a tone, but varying so many other things that you don't get bored with it. In fact, I wanted more of it. And this wasn't a short track either, but I was heavily invested in what this built. And it was the first time really on the album where I really kind of got sucked in to everything it offered.
It's hypnotic.
Yeah, I think it's the first time I also shushed you.
Yeah, probably while we were listening. Because I was exuberant about it.
Yeah, and I was making you be quiet because I wanted to listen.
I was just in the zone, man. But yeah, and I mean, even later, like by around like 3:27, that's when it really takes off. That's when I can't even. It's not worth like breaking down in terms of like oh yeah, there's triplets. It's on a freestyle runaway train at that point. But yeah, it's. Tonally, there is a character here. It's just it's his acid trip or a nightmare of sorts. Because, frankly, toward the end of this track, it lost the tonal center ages ago. And this is what what I'm speaking of here is specifically the guitar, because that is what really just like makes it seem more dissonant than the actual tones that the printer sound is making. Because by that point, it's awkward. You feel tense by the very tail end.
I'm going to put you on the spot right now, but I can't remember his name, so I have to. Office Space, the character that Stephen Root plays, who can't find his stapler.
Oh, Milton.
Milton. This is the soundtrack to Milton's worst nightmare.
Okay, so we're in Milton's mind.
Yes.
During
an acid trip nightmare.
No, the night before he's about to burn the place down.
Yes.
It could even be because he's supposed to be the one everybody kicks, a hysterical nightmare.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that might even work even better with my mischievous idea.
Well, I love how we just took Squarepusher's concept and made it in a cubicle somehow.
Let's go to track 4. We were already printer, all right.
Yeah, we just kind of went from there. Let's go to track 4. Contenjas, or Contenjas.
Or cotton jazz.
I'm going to not pronounce that J. Yeah, let's go with that.
This is the first time on this acid album that I feel
an acid intro.
Right. The beginning to this is disoriented and kind of trippy and confusing. There's a strong emotional connection too. Like, it's definitely meant to put you either in a state where you feel like you're on something or enhance it if you are already on something. It doesn't last long. Yeah, it's about 30 seconds, but it's enough to really make you feel out of sorts.
The fact that it's kind of switched around, the exposition is less clear, in fact, much less clear. It's less consonant than the section that follows it. And by the time we get to 30 seconds in, although actually kind of does follow the path of the first track in that regard, because by 30 seconds, we're kind of back in rat-a-tat territory, I almost felt. It was sort of an F-sharp minor jam.
Structurally, it felt like we converted into kind of a neon utopia feel. Think neon lights and future, and it had a saunter to it, like someone strutting.
It was very danceable. In fact, I think John mentioned here some IDM in here.
Yeah, a little bit. Well, maybe more than a little bit. That saunter might also originate from the subtle piano tones coming back into it.
There's a lot of soloing going on.
And it was contrasting with a very tap-oriented beat. A little bit divergent than what we got previously, because this seemed more clipped. This seemed more like the tones themselves were a little bit sharper, a little more clear-cut, as opposed to having a little bit of oscillation or quiver in their execution.
Yeah, in that regard, it actually successfully manages to sort of capture what a whole lot of electronica tries to do. It kind of like capture this, like what you said, the whole neon utopia feel. There feels to be something like mysteriously futuristic about this. But what I also love, just as an element to note, is this like background synth that occurs only like between phrases. It's like an interlude of sorts, but it's like an interphrase interlude. It's more of a compliment than anything else. But it's like this rapid pace. like inaudible synth or builds to an inaudible place, because initially when it hammers down it's just like all right, and then it speeds up, it's like and then it fades because it's going so fast. Very strange, but it's like this high synth that does that between every single phrase here, and that actually occurs a little bit later too, but not before this sort of new section takes shape, this more dissonant, but, melodically dissonant section with a lot of warbles and a lot of, like, fugue-like soloing that finally culminates around, like, 1 minute 40 seconds in a almost, I equated to, like, J-pop, practically. It sounded like a J-pop dance song or J-pop trance song. It had those kind of sound bites, it felt.
Well, yeah, we got a little bit of what I guess we can call dropping the bass, because there's no really other way to phrase it. But
it's almost a legitimate breather.
Yeah, we get a little legitimate breather that gives way to this style of song that you're talking about. It feels more like a trance dance song, whereas we had hints of dance and it was danceable before. Now we're really in that kind of genre. It really takes that structure. It even feels a little safer as far as kind of the sound that it's producing. It does feel somewhat more familiar than other stuff we did in the song.
Yeah, but it's almost like a transition, because it doesn't really seem to last that long. Almost 20 seconds later, we're out of it, and now there's more of a theme back here, because there wasn't so much of a theme there. That was kind of just a soundbite, atmosphere transition. It's hard to describe. But now all of a sudden that we have a theme again around like the 2-minute mark, we start bringing back that element I noted, this sort of like rapid pace builds to like an inaudible, place in the synth. It was impossible to follow at that point, because that suddenly now was not the interlude. That is the dominating soundbite. That actually forges this theme.
Well, this B section theme kind of picks a fight with the A section.
A little bit.
What comes later is that tapping almost overlaid on top of the theme that trance section was producing. Almost on top of the melody, the general pacing of that trance section. And while it's as fast, if not faster, than it was previously, the actual pitch shifts, the actual tonal shifts seem to be following what the trance was doing itself. And that's a weird combination, because that rise and fall that was kind of steadier and a little more just a bass-oriented piece, hearing it tapped out is almost like a secondary song just busting through and influencing what's going on.
This is also the first track that I think follows what I could only call, because we talked about it subject-wise, we talked about it at length back in the Aphex Twin album, and that's kind of an Aphex Twin form, because this seems to really change its goal over the course of this entire track. It doesn't have the same structured elements that I noticed in the first 3 tracks here, where we kind of do bring it all back, and then we bring together elements of the A and elements of the B. Like John said, they just seem to be at war with one another here. When we have the A section, it's a little bit more tangible. It's easy to get on board with. And all of a sudden, as we move into the B section, all right, it's still intricate, but at points it's impossible to follow. And then from 3 minutes on, it was just flat out freeform. And that seemed to do that all the way straight to the end. It didn't really bring the first elements back in any way. It ended in a completely different place than we started, which is something that Aphex Twin tends to do a lot. Squarepusher, I noticed, likes usually to be rounded and come back. Cyclical, exactly.
And this final section is just pure discord. There's no rhyme or reason unless you're looking at the piece as a whole, unless you're taking this real end section and trying to eat it all at once, and you can't. That's the whole thing. This is being on a roller coaster blindfolded. You don't know where the twists and turns are going to go up. But unless you listen to it over and over and over again, that's the only way you can really get the feel for it, and I love that. I love just not knowing any melody going on here, any rhythm going on here, because all that's just out the door at this point.
Well, and your analogy to it, kind of like a roller coaster, is the fact that the way it ends, also with that kind of sudden stop, is like going over the big hill.
Almost.
Yeah.
You can almost hear the air brakes kick in.
Yeah. So, and what I liked about that is it's powerful because, and I mean, I know I've said this before, but it really is true with it, especially an album like this. Having a sudden stop on an album that tends to fade out or deconstruct, having that sudden stop is powerful. It adds kind of this drama to the end of the track before we go into track 5, which I appreciated, especially considering the way track 5 started. Track 5, which is
X Jag Neves or
Knives?
X Yog.
Ex-Jog Knives.
I really don't want to pronounce these J's. I don't know. Something about them.
Something about him.
Ex-Jog Knives.
You're a man who hates his J's. We get it.
Apparently.
What I was saying before
Sorry,
about
John.
how we had that sudden end, this track starts with something we also haven't started with, really. It's a very breezy synth intro. This is the closest to pure piano work that we've gotten on the album thus far on its own. Without anything else, it's just this kind of very open, breezy piano intro.
It's synth, but it's, it feels almost...
It feels more natural.
It feels almost orchestral, frankly, I found. It's very grand.
It was sweeping, yeah.
And also, John noted this, and I think it was pretty appropriate because it did seem to be like a similar tone to the kind of synths that they used to use, ELO, or Electric Light Orchestra.
Well, which I was listening to this past weekend while listening to this album.
So it was
perfect.
in your head. So it may be imperfect,
but it was old school. That's just the major part. It was an old school kind of an electronica idea, and it turns into a very familiar beat system that was sort of a rise, drop, rise, and it was something that I've heard a lot, like throughout. It was almost a poster child for early techno.
Well, but it's also a poster child for what Squarepusher tends to do a lot. I mean, the second you hear that thump following a very breezy opening intro, be worried, because he's going to do what Squarepusher does. From there, you know the drill. Whenever you hear the thump, it's going to get weird soon. He's going to start going towards something. There's an A section here, which I would describe as having these like defined groups with a very defined melody. I'm not going to go so far as to say it's like digestible for an average, pop goer, but it's a little more digestible. But then, and this is another John analogy. I'm analogizing you, analogizing you a lot today.
Something like we'll make up a word for it.
No, this was your analogy that it's like somebody just grabbed you and shook your head. Because it's like a digression in the midst of something that otherwise would be a lot more formulaic. Then all of a sudden he rattles it up. The rhythm all of a sudden doesn't have these steady groups. The melody doesn't have these steady groups. Everything is just suddenly out on a limb or a lot more dense, one or the other. And then he goes back to A. It's weird.
These, as Steve put it, digressions.
Let go of your head.
Digressions, or as I wrote down on my little piece of paper because I had to go elegant, a psyche shaker. Yeah, I know. It's overblown. But anyway, these little bits...
I like it better when I just quoted you.
These little bits, these digressions are pure fun, pure rush of adrenaline when it comes right down to it. And it's how the previous track ended. It's the interesting part. But at the same time, it's the part that borderline scary for how abrupt it enters and how abrupt it leaves. But it always leaves a little bit, because after this first little digression, we have an A prime. A's not back. A's got a little bit of a change to its melody, a little bit of change to its flow. There's a little more complexity going on.
It's an A prime. But yeah, I see what you're saying about, the idea that it could be a little bit scary, and that's also another strange thing that I feel is kind of being done with the whole acid concept. The idea that, whenever it gets really suddenly frantic, it's almost like having an anxiety attack. Like, you go from a really, really nice, safe, even place, and then all of a sudden everything is just it's out of your control, and you feel that way maybe for a certain length of time, and then inevitably you will probably regain control again. It seems to be the way he builds a lot of his tracks. I know this from previous albums too.
I think that is why, while John mentioned that parts of it were less entertaining than especially the head shaking parts, that's how I kind of related to this track, and related to a lot of the stuff that I got out of his work. Where I couldn't find clear emotion, I did find this wrestling with calm and anxiety, and you definitely get a sense of it here. What I like about this track is, we mentioned ELO, and it has that kind of arena rock feel in its scope. That kind of anxiety-ridden, head-shaking moment gives the entire track the dynamics that really made me enjoy the track. Even though the lighter parts were probably a little less interesting, I think because they were less interesting, it gave impact to those anxiety-ridden moments.
One couldn't exist without the other.
Yeah,
you're saying,
exactly.
And since these subsequent A primes, because this happens several times, seem to start gaining more and more of the character of these dissenting ideas, by the time we get to the outro, it's back to A. It really is that final push of this calmness, but it's really effed up at this point. There's a lot going on. A lot of this dissenting idea is there, and it becomes that calm that's not quite digestible. There's something lurking around the corner. If there was fear before, this is fear actually sort of invading the waking world idea. Your nightmares are starting to become a little too real.
Also, it's probably good that we keep going back to the word digression as opposed to really breaking these down into the other letter, that is the B, D, F letters. But instead, you can't really do that. Instead, you might as well just call them digressions. You want to see them connect in some sense, but the only thing you can really connect is A. When A comes back, you know it's A. But then when B comes back and then D comes back, they're different. They're just digressions. They go to a different place before returning, and that seems to be another thing he likes to do. You can never count that the same departure will be the same, despite that there is a cyclical fashion here. It's never the same way each time.
And considering the structure and the sound of this song, when we go to track 6, Baltang Arg, it's kind of very different. There's a little bit of a disconnect. I don't think it's something that would throw you off or ruin the record or destroy the theme, if there is one. But it definitely... It's not jarring, it's just different. And in this intro, the beat work at least, the backbone of this song really feels like, at least for the first minute or so, like a rap song, especially considering a lot of the nerdcore artists...
The backbeat to a rap song.
Yeah.
Like, it could easily accompany it, and they wrote it for that purpose.
Yeah, absolutely.
I dare say this is a safety net.
Yeah.
He's introducing us to something safe.
Because it's a very distinct motif. But
It's a very familiar motif as well.
But then, and this is an interesting moment here, because it almost starts as if it were to continue, as you said, Matt, along those lines, around like 1:15. It starts to get a little bit more serious. Now, Frank, to me, I don't know, I kind of went in a different place with this. To me, I heard... it's hard not to equate these things to certain things, despite that still he's just kind of giving you something fresh. But I kind of heard like a whole like sparring environment here, like something out of Street Fighter or something. The accents even sound a little bit like punches. They sound like strikes, all of that. But you feel this sort of ripping you away from, I suppose, the backbeat that was the rap act. But you said that could have gone into like maybe something else. If you interpret it as a rap act, well, there could be a second section.
So all I was saying is with the rap act is typically artists, like I can name a few, MC Frontalot, Schaefer the Dark Lord, and Adam Warrock to be specific, they'll go into a section where it's not a verse, it's not a chorus, it's like an interlude or a B section where they kind of spit rhymes quickly.
Yeah.
And they do it for about 10 to 20 seconds, saying words or phrases very quickly to the increased rhythm.
It's doubtful they could keep that going.
Right. If they had been able to, if it had only been a 20-second section, it would fit in the structure that was being built in the first minute or so.
Yeah.
But because it goes on till about 2 minutes and 8 seconds before we get any other changes, it's too long. While I'm sure there are rap artists who can do that for that length, it's unlikely that it would go on that long.
Which is why at this point I started, if we're just going for comparison's sake here, it's why I started to look at this through like more of a video game lens. Because you have the opening motif. If you don't see it in rap terms, I see it as more just the theme of whatever game you're playing. And then all of a sudden when it gets serious, that's your sparring section. And then when it goes full 2 minutes and 8 seconds, here comes the boss.
And you start getting like, "Bwah," kind of sounds oriented.
It's like this foreboding diminished chord, like outlined downward, and then it's at double speed and a lot more imminent. It's almost like you'd expect a battle to follow.
We're not in Street Fighter territory. This is just pure DBZ kind of just speed hitting. But then M. Bison shows up. It's the boss. It's the big bad guy, and there's
hopefully not DMZ.
A nice little slow build. He's walking onto scene. It's a long walk. And he starts walking and then running, and then there's
to this,
and it's an evil strut. Maybe not like evil, capital E, but it's definitely not a nice fella showing up here. But with all that comes on, and then conflict starts rising, it gets a little more. Again,
it gets a little more frantic.
It starts full on thrashing as we get toward the end of like 350. Again, very very imminent, but this time for like an awkwardly long amount of time that it's just thrashing the single steady beat over and over and over. But then sometime like after 4 minutes, it goes back to the battle as it were, but this time much more playful. In it like more of a higher register. I want to be in this game.
That's because it sort of infuses the. I guess we're calling it rap, A section, that introduction into it. It's a little more upbeat, and it's more like the bad guys beating up the song itself at this point. Not
or
really.
maybe you're winning. I don't know.
I don't know. But there's also a nice little element that gets thrown in here that really does strike a little bit of a unique chord, and that's the haunting notes, which are just, for me, a little bit difficult. As they breathe in, they screw up all the action. Everything just kind of, it doesn't stop, but punches miss.
Well,
if we're doing a fight scene, that's exactly
but it's
what
like
happens.
it's like, yeah, punches miss. You stumble, and it starts getting really, really complex after that. And frankly, this track is just—it's something to experience. It's one WTF after another. And then, I mean, again, talk about the way in which he forges his tracks. This is another one where he's not terribly cyclical. Again, he kind of just works this up and you know, ramps up the anger, ramps it up, and then finally it ends in pure static. Like someone just died.
Well, it's the idea that, honestly, in a realistic rise of aggression, eventually someone's going down, and it's not going to be pretty. It's not a video game where it's like slow-mo, they hit the ground, you win. In this, it's blood everywhere, somebody's down, the skull is cracked, and, like, it's a mess.
As soon as somebody says Street Fighter, though, this, as it gets to the really glitchy, discorded part, it's... If before he started beating up the song, at this point, the bad guy's beating up the actual TV. He's beating up the game console. Everything's starting to just break.
Yeah.
It never truly recovers from here. The chaos of the song itself just fully wins out. And that's why it dies with that static. Chaos won. I mean, that's what I can say here. Chaos won this song.
I can't help but feel there was some kind of, like, reflection or a reprise of perhaps an element in the second track, which was called Baltang Ort, and here all of a sudden we're in Baltang Arg. I want to almost see like a connectivity in terms of the character, because we began in such a solemn, dignified place in the beginning of track 2, and here it really did build to chaos and ended bloodily.
But the thing is that it really doesn't, like, there's some connecting factors, but I feel like we get a stronger connection to track 2 with our next track, Quang Bass.
Quang Bass.
Which starts with there's a dynamic of something that's very close and something that's very far away. Far away, you have this kind of haunting backing melody, and then in the forefront, you've got this kind of scatting, kind of fast rhythm.
And that haunting backing melody is kind of like that Cosmos feel we heard back in track 2. It's not quite the same, but it's sort of the same tone.
What's really interesting about the tones here, though, and the structure is that you clearly hear something that's in the background and something that's closer to the foreground. There is a disconnect between those sounds.
That's the big difference.
You can get this displacement kind of feel.
Well, it's a displacement because you get the backbeat from the get-go, whereas you didn't get that in track 2. You had to wait, you know, after the whole rah thing, and then finally, eventually, it does get to that. But here, it starts immediately with the backbeat. It's very present. It's also very repetitive, and not quite as dynamic either. Rhythmically, it's very crisp, kind of scratchy. You get like these scratching vibrations, but it persists with that for a while, at least all the way up to the minute mark, where all of a sudden you get these really, really astute strums, which was one of my favorite things here. Just the strums at key moments, almost sounding like someone reached inside a piano and just strummed away at the chassis, all 88 keys with the dampener pedal down. That's what this sounds like. I would argue, perhaps exactly is that.
These little varying strums inject a little bit of a mutation into
the otherwise steady backdrop. Yeah.
It gives it a creepier feel.
Well, it also subtly shifts it. I mean, it still goes back to form because it's not just these strums. Eventually, also there's like a gong, like a background big, you know, Asian-oriented gong going on. It's a little more crisp, but very muted.
I think that's what I feel in the piano, though, because when you do it all at once, it kind of sounds like a gong.
It's subtle. It's a subtle little, like, extra little strand of DNA in the machine going on right here that changes it, but it still goes back to form. These little mutations
they do build.
Get weeded out.
Even that is a mutation. I'm not even sure. Actually, I thought it kind of took over, as if, like, the rest is being weeded out, because those strums, they get louder later. They even get eerier because they linger for so much longer. But here's the thing to note. It is one among many layers. That piano is a layer, but so are these little, like, laser pistols that occur.
I wrote down laser pistol pew-pews, because it's kind of the best way to explain it.
Why not?
They end up being typical soundboard-style space sounds, because there's almost, like, your standard, something from, like, 8-bit, like, thrusters or something like that.
But that's just, again, one among many. You also get like this, what I sounded like crashing waves. Also things that sounded like broken machines trying to catch, almost like they did way back in the beginning of track 1. And then finally these industrial hums for like a really long duration. And that seemed to be the one that persisted and plateaued for a very, very long time. But all in the course of this, it's really, because the foundation is so steady from the very beginning, this is the dynamic element. The sound bites, strangely, which are normally color and external, now they're the main element. They're the things you wait for because they're the most dynamic piece.
It's somebody messing with my Galaga. They're playing. It's exactly that. The sound bites are the characters on screen interacting with one another, the firing of your lasers, the movement of the vehicles, or what have you.
You mean your Galactica?
Galaga.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that's
what it was called. You're right.
Pac-Man, all that sort of stuff.
That's right.
It's the drone, the beats. That's just the music that continuously plays as you're playing the game. But someone's glitching it. Someone's messing with it.
Like I said, I had said earlier when we were listening to the album, it's an evolution through sound bites. Like the whole song is focused on those sound bites, and they help develop and change the song until it unravels towards the end. All of the building that it's doing very slowly is hingent on those sound bites.
But it stops. There's a dead stop, and that is one of the most interesting pieces. We've talked about this at length in a lot of different episodes. The use of silence is very hard to pull off the right way.
We get a hard 2 seconds of dead silence with no music, as if it were the track ending. And then from there, the rhythm changes even more, and we get a kind of almost deconstructing of what was being built.
The deconstruction, actually, I thought was just prior to it. It seemed to deconstruct until the portion where it just pulled a dead halt, and then it's about
like
maybe
deleting code.
This would be like about 4 minutes 17 seconds, but just the silence for that full measure, and then we seem to go back to the A section. To me, I'm not sure it was really a deconstruction.
You're right,
except maybe a fusion.
It was
of
more
certain elements.
tense, I feel, than the earlier part that it's representing.
That's the thing. It's more tense. So that's why the deconstruction occurred prior, and then all of a sudden here, the rhythm is kind of like it's taken itself up a notch. It's not nearly as backseat. The sound bites also, though, do completely take over at a certain point, but they're both like equally pronounced. Also, the laser, think of all the sound bites. The laser effects are more pronounced. It seemed like the broken machines were back, and the industrial hums just kind of stayed. Also, those laser effects felt like they were a little bit more pitch-bendy. They were accentuated in some way. So they're only deconstructed by simply being merged with each other.
It's
And fusing into the thing you can't pick them out anymore.
Deconstructed isn't the word. They're corrupted. One and the other fighting against one another. They're influencing each other too much.
Creates chaos.
Yeah, it's not 100% chaos because the through line is still there. There's still enough familiarity throughout the final few bars that I don't feel like anything was truly lost. But it's a literal form of glitch if we're going to equate it to Galaga. In my eyes, it's corrupted. The game itself is going off hinge.
Well, to start infusing some opinions here, I mean, though you could see this in 2 different ways. On one hand, it's flat-out exploration. It's flat-out, it's another example of sound art. He's fusing all these elements together, trying to see how they'll work in the end. But also, there's a tendency, like a lot of closing material, to just kind of put everything in one pool and see how they function. But I did find myself slightly less invested toward the end here than I was earlier, because I kind of liked being able to pick out the details, and I liked the eeriness that was built. I liked the big 2-second culmination, but I'm not sure the reprise was quite as impactful to me.
Well, before we get into the final track, this song was kind of a precursor to how we kind of feel about the final track as a whole, only because the way it kind of gets intense and is a summation of the track. The final song is a summation of the album. But before we get to that, I want to make it very clear what Steve said about it being sound art versus the music and how this is a clear picture of sound art. I did not like this song. To my ears, I disliked it immensely. I just didn't enjoy it. It was harsh. It just I didn't really like it at all. That said, though, I feel it's one of the best examples of excellent sound art that I've ever heard, and actually kind of makes me eat my words a bit on how down I had been on sound art in the past. I feel like
we've had a lot of examples. We've had a lot of examples in the way of Flying Lotus going back to episode 19, again in episode 131, and Aphex Twin in episode 126. All of these things, like, it's you have to treat them that way because they're not meant to be listened to in the same way that we approach a lot of other music. They're more of an experience, just like I said about acid techno earlier on. Sometimes they just set out to screw with your head.
And I feel like, whereas in the past I've been very down on it because I feel like music needs to be listened to. You have to enjoy it. I'm more inclined to disagree with myself now because I kind of get it. Squarepusher really kind of gave you a perspective and a sense like you were almost on the outside looking in, and I was able to respect and understand what he was building and what he made.
You're actually able... It's a dictionary. It's not a very good read, but you learn a lot of words out of it. I mean, that's what it really comes down to, because some of his ideas are just frankly mad.
Well, let's look at the final stretch. Track 8, D, Frozen, AC, or AAC, like the Apple proprietary file. I don't know.
Who knows?
So this starts with a pulsing intro, something that we've heard before on this album, we've heard before in this genre or its contemporaries. You know, just a very kind of almost human pulse. Not really a heartbeat, but just a warm kind of pulsing sound.
It's also kind of foreboding, though, equally. And it
Trump-
also just follows two chords, mainly, to open. It's just two chords back and forth. They kind of pivot, and then the industrial stuff kind of starts up again, almost like in the beginning. It's a mix, though, of a lot of different elements of this album. It's a mix of cosmos sounds. It's a mix of industrial, and also maybe your favorite horror movie to bring in the whole foreboding element. But I would maybe argue that in certain sections here, it would bring in your favorite cheesy horror film, because there are certain times where you hear that synth sound, and it's just like, well, how scared am I, really? It's a funny-looking monster.
As a whole, this is one of the few songs, or maybe even the only song, that I feel like just has a through line with it. Just has a solid core.
Remember, it's a piece, not a song. The only song might be the rah rah rah. I'll have to add those lyrics to A to Z.
The through line here of this piece, the solidity of it, is kind of disappointing. The fact that it just evolves without really stealing elements, without screwing with the elements of the previous sections, because it does have a very sectional kind of a feel to it, is pretty disappointing, because I wanted the effed up stuff.
I think it's also, you do have to remember this, because we're at the tail end of the album here, some of the stuff does start to blend in your mind over the course of it, so, you know, it's possible that, I say this a lot about albums as you experience them. If you took a track toward the end and then you moved it earlier in the album, well, would you notice it in the same fashion? Maybe you'd be more intrigued by it. You don't know. But all you're getting the industrial, the cosmos, the horror stuff. You even start getting like the kind of depth and resonance. Like around 2:30, it was very crisp, almost like the kind of stuff we got back in Kang Ding Ray in episode 133. The pops are very crisp, and it's kind of hard to sort of like these contrasts in texture all at once. You know, there's nothing really to latch onto except these kind of disparate feelings, and you don't know which one is right. You don't know which one defines the track or the album as a whole, which is why this was a tough closer.
Well, I think also the problem that really kind of hurt it as a closer, at least for us, I'm getting the sense that because it felt more like closing materials, this kind of summation of everything we'd heard before, but without kind of screwing with you, as we've been saying.
Yeah.
It kind of left us wanting. It's the first song to really kind of feel its length. I mean, all the tracks are around the same length, and I wasn't bored by any means, but that said, it did kind of...
To be fair, there was a little consonant element more toward, like, you know, the late 3-minute mark. It was a little more of a synth melody there. That was something you grasp hold on, but then he retracts and does weird stuff again. You know, it's a lot of that back and forth. But we heard it.
Right. That said, like, it felt more like the literary definition of a conclusion. When you read a story or an essay, and the conclusion usually just kind of sums up everything you've learned the whole time.
And is poorly done, like 90% of the time.
That's what this kind of really feels like.
I see.
But there is one little aspect that I did thoroughly appreciate from an artistic point of view, and that was the actual closing note.
It was just this hard screech.
It was just it was ear-hurting.
Nails on a chalkboard kind of thing.
It felt like the feedback squeal from, like, amp interference.
Mm-hmm.
And musically, you never want to do something like that. Artistically, fit the album very well. Fit the idea of the chaos and discord and all the different things that we talked about. Just to a T. That was a great period for a kind of a weak final sentence.
Like, I think that it's very true that kind of moment also kind of gives you an impact. Like, it makes you. How do you put it? Like, I'm trying to kind of like
use a different metaphor than mine.
Yeah, and not be cliche. But, I mean, the screech was kind of obnoxious, but again, you're right. From a sound art perspective, it only made sense. Oh, because of the loose themes that we're building here about discord and like horror and screwing with you. If this whole album's been him screwing with you, how best to screw with a listener than by giving them an ear-piercing sound?
Yeah, that's even a little bit more. Yeah.
So, and I think that's really what he was looking to do. I mean, obviously, it was intentional. Why else would you put that sound? All right, let's wrap up this bad boy and move on. So here's the thing with my lovely co-hosts going well out of their way to bring a lot more instrumental and electronic music on within the last year or so.
You're welcome.
Hey, I just reached for a name in the depths of my library, an old name too.
I sometimes struggle, I'll admit, with purely instrumental albums to find a connection. Not always. There have been ones that I have really related to strongly and others that I didn't relate to at all. Like, I probably rated on the lower side in the curve for Aphex Twin because I just didn't get that connection that you guys found in that album. This album's an interesting beast because emotionally, besides the minor kind of emotional points we hit on or the vagaries that we kind of applied to the tracks, there was no heavy emotional impact. There was no sad, happy, angry, no extreme emotions. But I did get a sense of aesthetic and a loose theme. There's definitely a musical arc. I mean, all the tracks are connected. There's an interconnectivity between the tracks that give it a fairly strong structure. But I don't know. I feel like talent-wise, he's definitely doing something that we don't hear a lot of. It pulls from other places, but it's not something we hear all the time. It's got elements of stuff we've heard, and we mentioned that, but more or less, it's definitely he's doing something interesting, especially this concept of actually, for lack of a better word, trolling your audience. This idea that he's setting stuff up to knock them down. It's interesting. So I was definitely from a sound art, first of all, learning to understand sound art from this interesting perspective, and actually getting some entertainment out of the record. I think that it has some strong qualities. But as far as strong theme or emotional arc, there really isn't, besides the vagaries we mentioned already. And I just feel like I need something more concrete than that. I think he definitely has the ability to do more. I'm curious, Steve, before I wrap up completely, do you feel this is one of his better works? Or do you feel like it lacks what his old works had? Because I have no history with him.
That's very complex, which is why I completely avoided touching upon this in my intro. I'm not even sure if I'm going to touch upon it in my outro. But I will say this, that as a high schooler, when I first heard of his name, I considered myself, I think I said this in my intro last week, in fact, to the album. I considered myself pretty open to most things. He gave me a run for my money. But with age, and perhaps with his own age too, I found this album to be a lot more digestible. Okay. Quality-wise, I can't speak to it.
Got it. That's kind of all I needed. And I agree. Digestible is the best way to put this record.
Which just means I also maybe I can just appreciate it, which coincides with digestibility. You don't know.
It's really hard to say, and this is an album that's been one of the more difficult to really kind of put my thumb on. It's just because of the kind of environment it's breeding. Like, this way that we're looking at it, I think, is bred by where this album kind of exists in its own universe. But that said, as far as talents go, I feel like he has a unique talent to himself, and he does unique things. But in the Pantheon Music Ever, I feel like, there's still more to this. I feel like he could create, while screwing with you, he could create a stronger emotional impact, and it just wasn't there. It was kind of, you were awash of kind of a loose feeling. I don't want to ramble on forever about it. I think that it approaches upper echelon, but because I'm still kind of left with a big question mark on a lot of it, I have to rate it under a 4. So for me, it's a solid 3.9, because he is definitely a talent, and he's definitely approaching strong territory. It's not average by any means, for sure. So that's why I think it sits at a strong 3.9 for me.
This was a trip. Honestly, I love the album on a personal level, because I haven't listened to anything like this. I mean, we listen to techno. We listen to a bunch of techno, but it's not this type of techno.
I'd encourage any listener to pause you and then replay your excitement last week when I introduced this album. It's
been a while since
I wonder whether it lived
acid.
up.
In fact, we'll let you go do that. Okay, we're glad you went and did that.
This is something I'm going to argue against you, Matt. You said not real heavy emotional connection, and that's where I think a little bit of the point you may be missing. And it's not a fault of you. It's just I approach this a little bit differently. This is not making a setting on its own. This is not making a theme on its own or emotional connection. This is supposed to F up the world around you. When you listen to Glitch, when you listen to Acid, when you listen to the weird techno stuff, you are taking what is around you, your actual setting, and changing it. And I think this album does it fairly well. Maybe not to the level of, without, the application of barbiturates or something like that can achieve, but it still messed with me when I was listening to it. To the point where I was closing my eyes while driving a car, bopping my head along. Not the best combination. But it was a mind trip at aspects. Being a mind trip throughout would have definitely been bad. I'll say that right up front. You cannot screw with an audience that way for 45 minutes or more. I mean, you can't do something like that unless, Clockwork Orange shows up or
trips
something
have to
like
have
that.
highs and lows. You can't stay consistent.
For every Clockwork Orange or Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, which are, I guess the video, the movie equivalents I would for something like this, you still have plenty of duds out there.
How about Eraserhead? Yeah. Keep going.
It was really solid throughout. I mean, until that ending and the stinger, the last little bit that he throws in there, almost redeems the song as far as the overall arc goes, but that was really the weakest part of the whole album. It winded down towards the end. But I think it did its job. I think it really set out to kind of change what I was experiencing while listening to it, and I think that's what it was intended to do. So for that, I'm gonna be bumping it up 4.25. It's in that same sort of territory as a lot of other electronica we've reviewed, like King Ray or Aphex Twin. It's doing something better than what I've found everybody else doing, and it's doing something a little bit unique in its own way.
As a musician, these tracks put me in a rather weird place. I admire a lot of these tracks, and I admire the guy who wrote them. I also aspire to, I think, some of the same things on this album. I have more of an electronic music background now than I did when I was in high school, so to your point earlier, Matt, maybe I really wasn't in the right frame of mind back then as now. Back then, I was just like, all right, well, it's interesting, but I couldn't get through it on a full album scale. This, I got through pretty easily. Perhaps the only falter was really that last track, where I was just wondering, whether it was maybe pulling some of the punches. I think it did. But the thing is, other things on this album, I guess also as a musician, kind of frustrate the crap out of me. I mean, there are sections where, my own tastes and leanings would obviously push me in a different direction to make different choices. I think one of the main things that will keep this as an upper echelon piece to me is just because it relies so heavily on rhythm, which I know is strange because of my whole intro. I love the fact that it goes there. I love the fact that it uses that as its primary go-to tactic, and tone really takes a back seat. It's just there to provide some color and eeriness. It's not the primary element, except in the cases where he wants to go dissonant, where it coincides perfectly with the frenetic rhythm. But I don't know. There are times when I just wish that he would use that to a bigger degree on these section changes. So I just wish that there were other things happening there. I think that's how I feel about a lot of his work, but that doesn't mean that I'm not on board for the ride. I think this is a great experiment, and I think it's a tight experiment. Also, it's one of the best, perhaps one of the best electronica albums that I've listened to personally in terms of a full album arc. I think that each and every track here, because it's concise, it really is. 8 tracks, that's easy for most people to get through. Some of them are a little bit on the longest side, but they change up and they give you something on each and every minute. Notice I'm giving timestamps here because there are not always subtle changes. There are changes, and they're well-married ones. It's not just an electronica artist going off on a spree. Despite the name acid techno, I actually think this is really born of a concise, clear-headed composer. So all I can do really as far as a rating is concerned is compare it to the other stuff that we've reviewed. I mean, we did Aphex Twin. I gave that a 4.2. We did Kang Ding Ray. I bumped that up for having a very, very unique theme to, I believe, I think actually that was a little bit lower because it wasn't quite as investing on a moment-by-moment basis thing. I think that was a 4.13. It was really weird.
You were odd about that one.
I don't know. Yeah, maybe I just like...
You wanted to go in between me and Matt, if I'm not mistaken.
I went for the gut there. But, you know, in this case, I think it's just... I think it offers different things. I think it's in the same exact ballpark. Obviously, 4.2 and 4.13 are not far apart. I think this is maybe a hair up. I'm going to push it to a 4.3 because I just flat out enjoy it more. There are parts there in the middle of this album, early, middle especially, where I'm focused. I am bobbing my head along. I'm tapping. I'm trying to keep up with the crazy rhythms going on.
Or you're shushing somebody who's trying to talk over it.
Precisely. And I'm just, I can't remember being that involved in a piece in terms of, like, air drumming and air guitaring probably since, like, Edgar Winter's Frankenstein. It's really that level for me in portions, and I think that really is worth the extra mark. The rest of which is just, it leaves certain things to be desired, but I know that's a shtick. So I'm going to put into a solid 4.3.
I think that ultimately it might have gone over my head, and it's why I'm where I am, but I wouldn't change it because while the moments did really pull me in...
Do what I did. Sit with Squarepusher for 9 years. Then come back to the rating.
All right. I will, this podcast as my witness, reassess this 9 years from now and see if I enjoy it more.
Okay, I'm putting that on my SkyDrive right now.
Yeah. Everybody Google Calendar it. Yeah, that'll be around like episode 600, so
that's fine. I got some time.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I think it could just be me personally that it went over my head. That said, still sits at a 3.9, and that's still not bad even for me because it's still towards the upper echelon. He's not a 3.
And you flat out said you dislike points, and I know that sometimes, especially when we first started, you rated low for disliking.
Right, which, isn't always necessarily fair. So I want to go back to something we were talking about a little earlier. I mentioned that I went to the Warped Tour, and I first and foremost, before we even get to our topic, want to take a moment to thank MC Lars again, not because I got a free ticket. I don't want it to seem like I only enjoyed the show because I went for free. It's not the case. I would pay to see MC Lars every time. I've been very blessed and lucky that he set me up with a press pass the first time I saw him recently. I've seen him times and times before, but the last time when I interviewed him, he gave me a press pass, and this time he gave me a guest pass, and I'm super thankful for it and would gladly pay to see him anytime. That said, I want to talk a little bit about how cost of tickets for events can affect how you kind of view that event or experience. Now, what do I mean? I'll give a very specific example with the Warped Tour. The Warped Tour 6 years ago, I went and I spent hundreds of dollars on scalped tickets for me and my girlfriend at the time. We got in to 6 or 7 hour festival in the brutal heat in the middle of the summer in New York. In this case, New Jersey. We were there for a few hours, and then she fainted due to heat exhaustion. I was sick and nauseous. We had to leave. We went home. I wasted money, saw 3 bands, and had to leave. That was very upsetting. I swore off Warped Tour for a very long time due to delicate constitutions, which is fair enough. This recent time I went, thanks to MC Lars, I had a very different experience. And I think part of it was the fact that I didn't pay for the ticket. I was very uncomfortable. The heat was bad. I stayed for the bands that I really, really, really wanted to see. And then I left. And I didn't feel as bad about it because I didn't pay for the ticket. So even if I had fainted due to heat exhaustion and had to leave early, I wouldn't have felt like I wasted my money. That said, maybe someone might argue, well, you valued the experience less because you didn't pay for it, which is a possibility. But this is where this kind of idea came from, this idea that because I had the great honor and benefit of having a free ticket, which I'm very thankful for, I was able to leave early guilt-free because I didn't feel like I was wasting money.
That's because of something called the hedonic addiction. It's an effect where when you buy stuff, it makes you feel so good for so amount of time. But when you buy it again, it doesn't feel as good that second time. It's basically the heroin effect. It happens with all possessions, but this honestly only really applies for good events really that much. If something's crap, I mean, you pay for it or not, it's gonna still be crap. You just I mean, you may say at least I didn't waste money on this, but at the same time, it's still a negative experience. It might be slightly more negative, but it's still going to be not good.
I have an anecdote to go along with this. Somewhere in the area of 5 to 6 years ago, I decided to see 2 concerts in one day. It was very challenging because an artist we formerly reviewed, that would be Chad Van Galen, episode 97, I believe, was performing for a free concert at the South Street Seaport. That same day, a friend of mine was also going to a Primus concert, and I really, really wanted to go to that Primus concert. Same exact night. Now, they were only in the area of like 2 hours apart, but I also know that concerts run long, so there's going to be a lot of overlap, not to mention travel time. Primus, for anyone in the New York City region, would obviously know this. They were playing in the Williamsburg not the Music Hall, but the waterfront Williamsburg venue right in the East River. So to go from South Street Seaport to Williamsburg, I had to cross the river. So, of course, I saw Chad Van Galen, and finally when that wrapped up, I decided, all right, well, I know that I'm going to only get maybe half of the Primus show, and I didn't buy the ticket yet. Remember, Chad Van Galen, free concert. Didn't buy the ticket yet for Primus, and I'm like halfway through. Am I even going to get in? The best I'm going to do, maybe, is meet my friend after the show. Nevertheless, I'll try. So I rush in the subway, the 4 train uptown, go to Union Square, get in the L train, go over to Bedford Avenue, walk toward the waterfront, and here I am on the sidelines, and I can hear Primus playing. They're over there. Of course, it's an outdoor venue, so I can hear them, but I can't see anything. There's a big wall there, and it didn't seem like there was any chance of getting a ticket here, except for the fact that this guy, who looked really frustrated, walked up to me and just flat out was just like, here's 4 tickets. Do you want them? I gotta go. He was waiting for someone, clearly, and he just didn't want to wait anymore. He looked like he'd been through a ringer. So he handed me 4 tickets, and I took all 4 of them, and I'm like, all right, well, I have more than enough now to get into this concert. And then I overhear a little conversation about a couple of other guys who were like, they were out front, and they wanted to get their friend in, but they couldn't. They didn't have enough tickets. So I did that thing that shouldn't be advertised on a podcast, but I did that thing. I thought I'd make an offer. Literally for like a fraction of the price, just like $20. It was a lot more expensive, but I offered them $20 for this ticket. And then another guy also wanted one, so I offered another $20 for another ticket. And after I made that offer, they were like, all right, great. But I told them, I just got these. I told them the absolute truth. Some guy just handed to me. I don't know whether these will work. But you stay with me. I guarantee you if they don't work, you know where I am. I'll give you your money back on the spot. So we stay together. We go up. We all get scanned. We're in the concert. I went to 2 concerts with a surplus of $40. I enjoyed my day a lot, despite the fact that I'm very far from Primus. Les Claypool is a speck, but I meet up with my friend. We're there, we get a beer, and we saw maybe like the last 3 tracks. I don't care. I went to 2 concerts, and I got $40 to do so.
Okay.
What was that theory called again?
Hedonistic adaptation. Here's the question.
Guilty as charged.
2 questions. Actually, we'll start with this. Which was the better concert? I don't mean the actual music, but the experience. Which one felt better?
The first one. I had wanted to see Chad Van Galen for ages, and I went solo. There was no one around to do so, and frankly, I don't know any other Chad Van Galen fans. I'm just like, that's a personal thing for me. I adored Skella Connection. You'll hear me rant about that on episode 97, and I just wanted to see him live. He's from Calgary, Alberta. What are my chances? I had never seen him to be performing in New York in the future. So, yeah, that felt really, really good, solo or otherwise.
Okay, then my second question is, do you think the trip to the second concert or the actual getting free tickets and actually making a few bucks off of the second concert affected the way you viewed it? And I don't mean from a musical. I mean just from the actual sitting there experience type of a deal. Do you think it had any bearing?
Do you think it had any bearing on my enjoyment?
Yeah. The fact that you had to run around in a different way to get to the second concert.
I think it did. First of all, I got an anecdote I mean, that was worth it. I can't tell you how many times I've told this story, although interestingly enough, not on the air, up till present. But it really did affect it, because I know that if that didn't happen, then I probably wouldn't have even gotten to see the concert. I know that my plan up until that guy made me that offer was literally just to stay on the sidelines and listen to Primus.
But my question is, you didn't just get a free concert. It wasn't a concert that was free to begin with. It was a concert that you got a ticket to.
But you don't feel drained in the process. Thus, it really did affect my enjoyment.
But this wasn't getting a free ticket to Warped Tour or something like that. This was even further. You made a few bucks off of it.
Yeah.
Why doesn't that make you feel even a little bit better? Even if you're tired or anything like that, why doesn't that make you feel a little bit better than the first concert? Because that would actually go against what we're talking about right here, or what Storm said. It goes with what I said.
Maybe you make a very good point.
You actually made a few dollars. You were rewarded for going to this concert. It wasn't even you got the concert. There was additional rewards.
You know what? You do make a good point. If that was my reaction, that the first concert was still more enjoyable from a personal standpoint, and that would have been free anyway, whether I had even made the decision to go out to Williamsburg or not, yeah, you know what? That actually is a pretty good, strong case toward the fact that I guess at playing devil's advocate, sometimes money doesn't matter. The story did seem to be ancillary to my even going to the Primus concert.
Which is what brings me to the next point. The adaptation applies to material things a lot quicker than it applies to experiences. When you have equal value items or experiences when it comes to actual investment of time or money, it's already been scientifically proven multiple occasions that experiences always make you feel better in the long haul, because experiences have associated memories that trigger endorphins and all that sort of stuff. But in the most basic way, you can actually remember the experience. Even bad experiences in the hall, the before and after, if there was anticipation or if everything ended up turning out okay, can trigger happy responses.
That's true. I'm having serious problems with memory lately, but I can remember every detail of that night. I can remember the words that the guy said, the second guy who wanted to sort of buy the ticket off of me, and he went up to me and said, "Hey, I have a ticket to go to the concert, but Joey doesn't have a ticket, so, maybe you could help me out a little bit. What do you want for it? $20? That sounds good, man. That sounds great." And he was like an old rocker. They were like 45-year-old rockers, and they desperately wanted to see Primus. So, he bought me a beer afterwards.
I think also the thing that made me think of this discussion point, and also kind of the dynamic of Warped Tour 6 years ago versus now, is also I was younger. I'd spent money and then was frustrated, and it was a negative experience. I guarantee that whether I spent however much I spent, and I will not go into detail, or $5, I probably would have been just as pissed because I wanted to see a ton of bands that day and I didn't get to because someone else got sick. And it would be very selfish of me to force us to stay.
The biggest aspect of that is that there's a penalty system associated with it. In that you're paying money, and that's the penalty for the fun that you're having.
Right.
As opposed to the material goods that you're not spending on the most recent concert. Because there's no penalty associated with leaving early, you're able to relax better.
Yeah.
There's no obligation.
So, and I think that's the kind of perspective where it's not good or bad, but there's less guilt or expectation.
Well, here's the big opposition. Of course, for things like Warped Tour festivals, they're the ultimate, in terms of taxing you. They demand the largest amounts of money from you, and they demand the largest amount of time. If you want to really make the best out of that money, you won't go to just one day. You'll go to all things. For people that go to Bonnaroo, it's a cross-country road trip for them. Yeah. For people that go to Burning Man, also cross-country road trip, plus a lot more that I think they're expected to throw themselves into. Of course, they have a great time, but you're kind of set back, and you have to make sure that, your job allows this. It's a lot of coordination. But the antithesis to all of this, and the antithesis to that, and working down the ladder to a regular concert and an arena venue, is finally just, your bar and show. That's a lot of times places that don't even charge cover. Places that just they put on music. If you want to listen, sure. If you don't, sure. You're not really paying money to see the music itself. Most people who are paying the money, they're just paying to drink, and that's it. But you're all of a sudden getting music that you didn't expect. a lot of times I find this is how people get into local bands, because they're there, they got music, it fit the environment, maybe they're talking to someone who was close to them at the time, and then all of a sudden, all of this for not a dime or shred of planning out of their pocket. It was purely spontaneous, and that's how they became a longtime fan of a band, and they have a personal connection with it. They were there. It wasn't recommended to them. They found them, in a sense. That's a strong thing for a fan of music in general, and I am inclined to think it really is attached to not just the money factor, but the time factor. If you don't expect it, and you don't have to put anything in, you'll probably get a lot back in return.
Well, and also, while we are not advocating that you go to these venues and spend nothing, because they need to make money, and the bands need to be supported, it is often that...
We're addressing the flighty nature of the arts in general.
Right.
And the fact that, money is almost the side point, but it also does come down to that in the end.
But it's also like, I know a lot of indie artists who push hard for people to not necessarily spend money on their albums and spend more money on their live experience, or just to support them word of mouth, or all of this stuff.
Yeah.
But I think what's interesting about that situation specifically is also, for me personally, if I really like somebody and they're not hawking their CDs, or there's no cover charge, I'm more inclined to drop more money in a tip jar because they're really good and I want to support it directly.
Yeah.
There's no go-between. There's no cut. It's just you give money to the band gets the money, they spend it on whatever they spend it on, whether it's gas, instruments, production, whatever.
You're kickstarting them.
And also, it's
in
the
a more direct way.
it's the good old-fashioned, street-side charity, so to speak. And, you don't have to wonder, being like, what are they going to use that money for? You heard them. You heard what they do. It's service meets, exchange on the most fundamental level, but also the fact that it was never demanded. It's like whatever you'd care to give. It is very egalitarian and also very risky for an artist to base their entire future on that thin margin and that very narrow chance that they manage to get enough people onto their side. But it's very noble. I'm still surprised to see a lot of people do it.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's one of the pride points of the Way Station, a venue we've mentioned many a time. And Andy talked about this when he's on the podcast. What episode was that again?
That was episode 146.
He talks about how he wanted to build that kind of community, both for the artist and for the viewer of the art. That, with the exception of certain shows and certain artists who have showed up, he wants that environment. If you come, you hang out, you enjoy yourself. If you feel inclined to give, you do. But otherwise, just enjoy yourself. And it really works very well, especially for a local scene that's trying to build up we talked about this ages ago, how local music scenes come and go, and this is a real great way for him to perpetuate, at least within Prospect Heights, a very strong culture. And
you could say this is something desirable. I mean, bands desire it, even not just on like a street or local level. If you're touring the country still, it's very common to create PR schemes, because if you care about your fans, you try to work out ways, the whole crowdfunding thing, which you discussed recently with the band Sexy Heroes, correct? The idea of crowdfunding and trying to in a sense get a pool, so that way, fans will have to put in the least amount in order to enjoy your work. And there does seem to be that desire, because after all, that's how you're going to win fans over. People like that level of... People like doing nothing, I guess is the cruelest way of saying it. But it is the arts, anyway. It's something to be enjoyed, not always something to be consumed.
It adds a level of intimacy that is lacking when you just go out and buy a CD.
Well, also, MC Lars has a song called Download This Song, and it was before, downloaded music really became the height. It was still back in the kind of LimeWire era, but he talks about how music was a product, now it's a service. And it's true on a lot of levels that, it's not necessarily anymore something you physically buy. You may spend money on it, but it's more... How you spend money on it is more ethereal these days. Like Patreon exists as something you can subscribe to for a lot of artists, and you pay a monthly $1, $2, $5, $10 donation, and those monthly donations come together, and that artist release weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly content for all of that money you're investing, and it builds towards an album instead of just a straight-up Kickstarter.
Interesting.
There's actually a curious little thing that one of my favorite YouTubers does. He hosts a live Twitch stream of a homemade RPG, and there's stretch goals. As they're on Twitch doing this stuff, the people watching can donate money to cause events to happen. It's one of the most interesting ways I saw for these artists actually making a sort of like a serial television series to raise money for themselves. $200 gets a random addition to the encounter. $300 might be a positive thing. $400 might be a negative. And rarely do I see them miss out on like their big stretch goals of like $1,500 when they've already probably raised $2,000-3,000 over the course of like a 6-hour live stream. It's a pretty solid way of doing it. Now, granted, they're putting a hell of a lot of work into it, but it's one of the most curious, like, enterprising ideas I've seen in this new market that we're dealing with. Whether it be like music or video games or just content producers, it's just they have to find new ways, and it seems to be the new ways are actually being enabled by a lot of the organizations that are bringing the content to us. Whether it's the Waystation always offering music every night of the week, or if it's the fact that Twitch allows you to donate, there's always these avenues to, instead of having a penalty to go see a band, instead of paying to go see an act, you can instead feel the actual piece and then reward the person creating the piece.
Right. Well, let's get off the backs of the artists for just a second, because, you know, it does come down to, like Matt prefaced very clearly, obviously once a band or an artist makes a choice to be a career band or artist, then it still is kind of their job to make money. If that is their thing, then that really is their primary goal, and you shouldn't, you know, just put them down for expecting. Sure. They kind of have the right. So let's get off of them for a second and go more toward the listener. Obviously, and I'm going to bring this topic up again, although I'm sure it's come back in previous episodes in other forms, but torrent culture. Most people, especially if you lived or spent your adolescence in the decade that was 2000 to 2010, and even still to today, probably built a lot of their libraries on this if they wanted to at least get a certain dosage of music and a well-rounded sense of what was out there without really breaking their backs to do so. Is this a negative?
I mean, we've talked about this before. I feel like...
I know it's a broad way of putting it, but flat out, do you think it has helped or hurt?
So, I find that with the indie artists that I've befriended or have watched their careers kind of grow, artists that I've gotten into very early on, most of them will always say, download my album if you have to, but then tell everyone you know about it. And I think that in this modern age of networking, it's yes, if you're taking money out of the hands of the artist, it is detrimental. Period. End of story, it's detrimental. You pay for that artist to put food on the table sometimes. But if that album is a touring artist and you don't buy the album, but you tell 30 friends of yours because you're so interconnected in that state where he's touring, go see that show. Trust me, I'm a reliable music source. And they all go spend money on that show, buy merch, hang out with the artist, and then they tell their friends. That can be more valuable.
You know, it is probably, and this is not like me just copping out, because I pretty much am admitting, of course, I was guilty of doing this back in the day. Sure. I was young in the 2000s, and this was a way for me to listen to as much music. As an adolescent, you're not really thinking about...
And there were no streaming services back then either.
No streaming services whatsoever. This is completely pre-Spotify. It worked from Napster up to Kazaa, up to LimeWire, and finally just flat-out torrent clients. But, you know, as an adolescent, you're not really thinking about the grand morality of everything. It's just you want to consume as much music as possible, and you realize very, very early on that there's so much music out there in the world you would never even go through it, even if you had like a piddling job working as a stock boy or a bag clerk. You'd never ever go, work up that library. So when you realize this, all right, you start passing around things. And I'm not trying to get out of it, but I think you bring up a good point. Like, I guess I really was the product, and also I spread the music in terms of like, well, here's everyone I know. I love this band so much. Here's all the files. I'm going to dump it on you. We're going to pass it around not through flash drives back in the day, but through flat out hard drives. Recently,
hard drives.
Yeah. Hard drives.
Burn CDs, man. Old school.
Wasn't enough for the amount that we were sort of passing around.
Oh, man, you were going real illegal.
I was going real... Well, I will say that in this particular case, it was my friend who passed it off to me, but it was a friend, he used to just like, all right, you're interested in a few bands? Here's a few of my favorites, right? And he'd dump like 30 gigs of stuff onto a hard drive. He'd copy it, he'd pull out the thing out of his computer, detach the IDE cable, and then hand me, because I didn't have one, an external internal hard drive adapter, which then can be connected through USB. And then I did the same thing thing to my friends, and a lot of bands became their favorites thereafter. A lot of the bands I mentioned over the course of this podcast were from those initial transactions. So, did they make fans for life? I'd say yes, through that rather unsavory tactic.
I mean, yeah, and I think word of mouth is more powerful than people give credit. Also, credibility is also more reliable than people give credit for. And what I mean by that is actually, I got an interesting comment the other day. I posted photos from Warped Tour, and a friend of mine said something. So, for those who don't know, I very often, on my own personal Facebook profile and on Crash Chords, when I remember, will post a song of the day or a song that's connecting to a quote that's important to me, because I feel like it's the fastest and most easy way to share music. Is here's a song, here's why I'm sharing it, whether it's as simple as this is my song for today. I had a friend, or have a friend rather, named Glenn, who is a fan of the podcast of Crash Chords and also a good friend of mine, comment on a photo I posted of me and Tatiana from Tap the other day. I'll be honest, Matt, I've been looking up every band you post about in your morning posts and all others because I see that you have good taste in such things. So thanks, even if you didn't know, for helping me out.
No.
I mean, but essentially he's saying because I have a credibility, because I have a music website, and because I post a lot of music.
Which is sort of a self-described credibility, but,
right.
3 years running, it's got bound to change.
But also because I post a lot of music, and he's run the gambit of everything I've posted, he's decided, compared to his tastes, whether mine is in line. Yeah. That said, my word of mouth carries weight, and that is as valuable as purchasing the music himself because he now knows what he might like just based on me saying it and may go out and purchase it on his own.
Yeah. In the end, it really does come down to the personal connection. It's either just based on like what someone learns from another person. I think this is infinitely more powerful because money cannot just buy investment on an album or on an artist by itself. That's the thing. You can't just solely rely on that, which is why it is a little bit silly to kind of like put all these restrictions on everybody, because in the end, that is really the core of how people will get interested in bands, in artists. That's it. It's not about, how much money the thing costs. Like, they'll get to that, and they will put that money out there, and they will put money out to the concerts eventually, if you can at least get that initial connection, which frankly is, literally priceless.
Yeah, those indie artists, that connection you make on a one-to-one level, the reason I am friends and such a fan of Schaefer the Dark Lord is because the first time I ever saw him perform, we spent 20 minutes talking about his work and how he started and all of this stuff, and without that personal connection, who knows if I would have liked him as much. Whereas MC Frontalot, I heard his music, bought the albums, and then made a personal connection. So it was a different... All roads lead to enjoyment of music if you follow them through. And I think that's kind of... There's no real right answer. Do you have a spam email for us, Steve?
Yes, I do.
All right, why don't you...
Did you think I didn't?
No.
Well, it's his job.
It
so
is
I
his job.
expect
You
it
had
from
one
him.
job, Steve. One job.
Among the other jobs he has.
The other many.
Yes.
This is a segment. What do you call it?
Portion? Clip?
Clip.
Excerpt.
Excerpt. There you go.
You're welcome.
Ampersand number 1091 semicolon. Ooh, guys, are you? Ampersand number sign 115 semicolon. You and number 1072. Lee up to. If you edit out the crap, you get you guys are you. And then half a word up to. Like tally up to. I don't know. But anyway, that's by Parajumpers Long Bear Dam.
You know what? I thought I was the only one that actually said ampersand.
You are the only one who says ampersand.
He just said it twice.
You mean
But he was reading the words of a robot.
No, he was reading
No,
the symbols
I
of
looked
a
at the
rotor.
symbol and I called it an ampersand.
Oh, okay.
That's the
I thought
and
the-
symbol.
I
You know
thought he
why?
wrote
Because
out
if
ampersand.
I were to say the and symbol, then that to me is the more simplified, just simple like
Plus sign.
down, yeah, almost like a plus sign with like one half connected.
Got
In
it.
fact, that's the terminology in math. You usually say and instead of plus for a lot of those things.
That's true. Well, because
exactly.
plus and negative, like plus and minus, means something different also
Yeah,
sometimes.
and there's
All
also
right.
there's also the
All right,
using
enough digression.
less.
What are we doing next
You use
week?
less instead of minus.
Yes.
So to connect it back to the way station and making those personal connections for bands that you didn't expect to see, our guest next week, and our guest for this month, his name is Joe Benjamin, and he is the lead in the band, Joe Benjamin and the Mighty Handful. I had seen them perform at the Way Station, and I was kind of blown away because Joe pretty much plays the conductor/lead singer role, while 8 or 9 people, and I might be exaggerating a little, but a bunch of people are on stage playing a variety of instruments: brass, woodwind, guitar, drums. It's a whole ensemble, and it's a pretty awesome sight to see on the Way Station stage. I enjoyed them very much, and we'd connected, and I'd given him my card, and he reached out to me to be on the show, and was very excited. Also very upset that Andy picked Belle and Sebastian, because he was gunning for that one. But
our guests are warring. Not
to be outdone, he picked something very interesting. A French pop band, as I best understand it. Their Facebook page describes them as French lyrics plus vocals, accordion, Southern American rhythms, and old Greek movie songs with a bit of jazz.
That's
a hefty, eclectic variety.
And so the band is, of course, called Banda Magda, and their last album, the 2013 Amour Tesla, or Tesla. I don't speak French.
Tesla.
Which I think is recent enough to be included in our big rating chart.
This was his choice. It's available on Bandcamp, so give it a listen. And if you like it, buy it, as we were talking earlier. But that's what we're taking on next week, as we will also, of course, feature some of the work of Joe's band. I'm very excited to have him on the show, so that should be a blast.
All right.
Since I'm now sweating through all my clothes and melting to the floor, before I sink below the level of the microphone, remember, everybody, music is life,
and life is good.
If you enjoyed this and other album analyses, topics, and guests, please subscribe to the Crash Chords podcast on iTunes, where you can also rate us and review us. For more media, also subscribe to Matt's one-on-one interview series, Crash Chords Autographs. To receive emails on all new content, subscribe at the top of our homepage. Also receive updates by liking us on Facebook, following us on Twitter at Crash Chords Web, our Tumblr, and our YouTube channel. And remember, keep the discussion going, because music is life, and life is good. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to share them in the comment board below each post. Otherwise, email us directly at admin@crashchords.com.